We're here to talk about how the law is tackling the online invasion of women's privacy and trying to draw a comparison between the UK and the US and highlight the different approaches. And sadly, just by way of introduction, there are many examples of how women's privacy is being invaded online, as Rebecca mentioned, not just deepfakes. So there's revenge porn, as it's frequently referred to, there's cyber stalking, cyber flashing, but also increasingly the creation and sharing of sexually explicit deepfakes. So what I would like to do, what I'm proposing is for my sort of, preliminary comments is to do two things. One, just let's look a little bit more deeply into how bad is this situation, because I think ultimately in terms of, coming up with what's the right remedy, how do we tackle this? It's not just the law, it's education, it's all these sorts of things. I think it's just important to understand what are we actually looking, what's the scale of the problem, and then secondly, how the law in the UK is evolving to respond to this recent phenomenon. And as Rebecca said from the outset, I would like to say it's not solely an issue for women and girls, but also for men and boys. It's a really important conversation. Everyone needs to take part of it. And especially, I think, when it comes to teenagers, you've already said this is obviously where it's at its most problematic. And I think boys and girls alike, they all need support from all of us, really, to help navigate these really difficult issues. So to begin with, obviously, most of you will know how bad is the situation, or what is a sexual deepfake? I mean, most of us know this, but nonetheless, just to make sure we're all on the same page, it's an artificial intelligence generated image which is designed to simulate a person's appearance. Now, as we all know, the simulation is frequently not of leading political figures, so not what we're talking about today, so the political deepfakes, but often celebrities, not just celebrities, and in the latter case, predominantly of supposedly nude female celebrities and frequently engaged in sexual activities. So the sexual or sexually explicit deepfakes. Now, the act, as we all know, of creating fake content is not new, but what is new is that because of the emergence of new technology and especially artificial intelligence, that makes it possible to create very real fake images. And also they can go viral on the internet in like a split second. So I think that just really exacerbates a problem that's in a way existed for a long time. Now, when did it start? I just thought, I was a bit curious, when I was doing the research for the panel. So when did this actually start? Because you read the papers and you see it's a problem. Well, apparently 2017, there was a Reddit user who conceived deepfakes and they actually set up an app that was called Deepfake. So which is a blend of deep learning and fake news. And that person used open source libraries, Instagram, YouTube to create an algorithm which initially allowed to insert famous people's faces onto existing bodies, pre-existing videos. These are apparently called the puppet master deepfakes. So not surprisingly, many of Hollywood's leading actresses were sort of the initial victims, so to speak. They were being deepfaked. Their faces, Scarlett Johansson, Jessica Alba, their faces were being inserted onto often naked bodies and often in a pornographic content. And that literally went so that app, the users, or the number of users swelled incredibly quickly. It became very, very popular. And but just to say from the outset, it's obviously not just celebrities who are impacted the most. I mean, the average Facebook user, I say now, but I'm very happy to be corrected by people in the audience, has apparently between 300, 350 friends, which obviously that helps create, apparently up to 300 million, 50 million photos a day. So most of us have a digital fingerprint, LinkedIn account profile, holiday pictures on Facebook, etc., etc. So with the technology that exists, it really is a threat to all of us. And I'll come on to give you a few examples of normal citizens who have been exposed to this and the really devastating consequences it's had for their lives. So there is very little empirical evidence, to be fair, on how accessible deepfake technology is and how prevalent this is, just because it's obviously a fairly recent phenomenon. We're talking sort of 5 to 10 years. As I said, it sort of started in 2017. But there was a study that in 2023 found that there had been a 550% increase in the creation of deepfakes since 2019. Fueled, as I was mentioned earlier, by the rapid development in technologies such as AI. There are also studies, so in the Netherlands, there was a study that by a cybersecurity company, which found that nearly 100% of 15,000 deepfakes identified in 2019 were pornographic, and that rose to 95,000 in 2023, again, of which almost up to 100% were pornographic in nature. So we can see the trend here. It's growing, and it's mostly sexual deepfakes that really are the problem. Now, in terms of the impact, obviously, sexual deepfakes are not real. So you might think, well, what's the big deal, But nonetheless, they really have the potential to have very similar catastrophic consequences for the women as the real life privacy intrusions, like as, revenge porn, where someone posts a real video that a woman might have been taken and might have taken of herself and post that on the internet. So just to give you some examples in terms of understanding the impact and the consequences. So I don't know whether you have seen this, but the BBC did one of the things I came across a while ago was a BBC documentary in 2022, and this is not about a celebrity. This is actually something that took place in Brighton. So there was a young woman who worked in the gaming industry in Brighton, tech startup, quite smallish team. And then suddenly she found out that a colleague of hers, who she considered to be, a trusted co-worker, she had a very friendly relation with, created a deepfake, a pornographic deepfake of her at home for sort of his private use. She did report the colleague to the police, who interviewed the man who had also posted the deepfake at some point on the internet. He, it was all taken down, but he did not face any criminal charges. Now, you can imagine, she was obviously horrified to learn that a colleague that she worked with daily had done that to her, and it really affected her confidence. And for a number of years, she wasn't really able to form any trusted relationships at work. She didn't really want to work in the industry anymore. So, all of this, a real massive change for the worse in her life, just because, someone thought it was a great idea to sort of create a sexually explicit deepfake of this person. Maybe one more, and then let's move on to the law. Two more, really. So one was, again, it's probably something you may have come across across this. It's quite a famous example that took place in Spain about a year ago in a small village. So there was a group of teenage boys who used an app called Cloth Off, which I think has fortunately now since then sort of disappeared. Not quite clear where the creators were actually based. Possibly they were saying maybe Russia. Anyway, it wasn't quite clear. But basically, these boys used this app. The mission of the app was to undress girls for free. Exactly. It did what it said on the tin, based just on a photograph. So these teenagers used the app to generate sexually explicit deepfakes of up to 30 local teenage girls, school friends, quite frankly. And then all of this was shared on WhatsApp, on Telegram, etc., etc. And of course, it had, terrible consequences for some of the girls, who some of them apparently are still afraid to leave the house, etc., etc. So you could say in the beginning, this was a bit of a, who knows what happened, but, some sort of silly idea, sort of the boys thing. And then the whole thing completely went, got out of control and led to some very serious consequences. And, thankfully, I don't think any of these girls have done anything more serious than feeling incredibly anxious and not leaving the house. But nonetheless, that's a possibility. And before we move on to the law, just something that I think it sort of shines a light on the fact that there's also boys that can really be at the receiving end of this. And this is another very unpleasant phenomenon called sextortion, which is which is a type of blackmail where basically people are being forced into paying money after an offender has threatened to release nude or semi-nude photos of them. It can be a real photo, but increasingly it's also deepfakes, because the people who do this are often, very tech-savvy young people. And it's obviously quite easy for them to create a deepfake, and sometimes easier than actually to ask the victim to provide them with a real picture. Now, interestingly, this has become so bad that at the end of April, the UK National Crime Agency took an unprecedented step and actually published an alert to teachers. It's really interesting to read. I really recommend it. It gives it's basically it was directed at teachers, but also contains some guidance to parents and carers, etc., how to talk to your children about this. There are some interesting statistics. So according to the NCA, which I'm thinking is a pretty credible source, around 90%, so the victims targeted are mainly young, boys or young men aged between 14 and 18. And that is that's about 90% of those targeted, which is interesting. And you may have read in the press that very, very sadly, there have been instances of boys taking their own lives, having been threatened with this, which just shows how terrible the consequences can be. And the NCA, I think, said something really, really important, and we'll come on and talk about this later in the context of education. It said, what's there's obviously the criminal law and all the things we can do. But one thing that is really important is also take the stigma away from these things. So because if you take the stigma away from the victims, then you also take the power away, of course, from the offenders. And ultimately, that's also why we're having the conversation. The more you talk about it and you just say, look, this happens to a lot of people. Don't be ashamed. Don't be embarrassed. You're not the only person. That can really also help, in addition to all the legal tools, at our disposal. But anyway, I thought that was very interesting that it is predominantly young boys which really came to me as a bit of a surprise. Honestly, I wouldn't have, if someone said to me, what do you think? I wouldn't have thought this. Who knows why they don't, but anyway. So I think to conclude on the impact, it's clear that this is a massive problem. It's getting worse, especially, but not exclusively for women. So, just a second, the second part of my initial comments is really, so how's the law responding to tackle the issue of sexually explicit deepfakes? So 2 angles really, and then I'll hand over to Michelle for the US angle of this. One is, if you're the victim of one of these things, usually you want to achieve 2 things. One is, how can I get justice and go after the perpetrator? But then secondly, also, how can I get the content taken down as soon as possible? Those are the 2 goals, right? Now, in terms of criminal law, there has been some development in the UK. So it makes sense to distinguish between the creation of the deepfake. So if you think about, for instance, the Cloth-Off app, the boys created the deepfake using an app, but then the sharing of the deepfake once it's been created. Now, in terms of sharing, as regards to sharing of a sexually explicit deepfake, there is a new criminal offence in the UK in relation to the sharing of sexually explicit deepfakes. And it became a criminal offence on the 31st of January of this year. It was done as an amendment to the Sexual Offence Act 2003 and brought in by the Online Safety Act 2023 that a lot of you are quite familiar with. Now, we have previously had offences in the UK criminalising sharing or threatening to share intimate pictures, but that was pretty much limited to real pictures and didn't capture the deepfake phenomenon. And it's now been clarified that the concept of sharing an image, a photographic image or a film, is broad enough to include computer-generated, AI-generated deepfakes, which is a great clarification. I think the other important aspect, which is novel, is that the new offense does not require that the person doing the sharing intends to cause the victim distress. So this is quite an important, in terms of the mens rea, this was certainly originally a requirement for the purposes of the criminal offense of revenge porn, so sharing of real intimate content, that the person doing the sharing had to have the mens rea to cause distress or harm or something, which from the victim's perspective is not that relevant ultimately, because, do you really care why the person, you might, but do you really care why the person did it? Maybe they did it for fun. Maybe they did it, we've just spoken about the extortion, in order to get some money. So that also is, now that lowers the bar quite significantly, which in itself we should talk about, raises some issues, because on the one hand that's good, it makes it easier to prosecute, but on the other hand, it's a crime that can literally be committed, at the click of a button. So that is also, in itself, will have some interesting consequences. Now, a creation sexually explicit deepfakes, it was meant to become an offence, but because, Parliament was dissolved, as we all know, it didn't sort of make it, that did not make it through wash-up. But I think it seems likely that at some point also this will also become criminal offence, because there are plans to that effect in the main parties' manifestos. 2 more points. So data protection law has obviously also a role in holding those accountable who create or share sexually explicit deepfakes. The creation of a deepfake will, necessarily involve the processing of some personal data as an input into the AI models, but also when you actually and also actually in terms of the deepfake output itself. And so data protection law does in principle apply. I mean, the fact that the data is fake doesn't mean that it's not personal. It's the basic principle here. Now, obviously, this will be incredibly fact specific because, for instance, there is obviously the household exemption that might apply in some. I mean, there are all sorts of it. It will be very, but in principle, it applies, and then it'll be very fact specific. What you can do, for instance, is there a breach of the accuracy principle? It's quite likely that some of the processing will probably, will not have a lawful basis. So that then becomes, as always the case, a case-by-case assessment. But in principle, it does apply. And then finally, in terms of obligations on the platforms, just to say that obviously we've got the Online Safety Act now in the United Kingdom, which imposes certain duties on platforms to make sure that the safety of users on the platforms is improved. There are certain obligations to take illegal content down swiftly, and when it comes to children, also just harmful content. So the fact that the deepfake will become, or is in part already a criminal offense, will obviously relevant and will have an impact on the obligations on the platform. So I think to conclude, we can see that it's a recent phenomenon. Usually the law is always a little bit behind and scrambling around, given the quick, the pace at which technology develops. But we can see that thankfully the law is responding, and that is one part, of the answer to the issue.